Las Cruces, New Mexico is known for its staggering beauty, with the desert on one side of town and mountains on the other.
We're the second largest city in New Mexico, but we are also still a small town.
This small town is home to 18-year-old Pad Guffey.
He was a really good-looking guy. He came from money, and he was kind of a smooth talker. He was a good guy.
This place is crawling with North Valley losers.
He's also from the south side of Las Cruces.
So there was a pretty big rivalry between the north side of town and the south side. You were either North Valley or you were South Valley.
Who is that? She's North Valley, dude. Forget about it.
Kim was a cheerleader at Mayfield and very popular. Always smiling and then just like your classic hot cheerleader.
This is so not a good idea.
Growing up, I don't feel like we ever felt like anybody was any better than anybody else, but there was definitely a divide.
That divide is the reason Pad has never seen or met Kimberly Hansen before.
How's it going? What can I get for you?
How about your phone number?
Let's see how you tip.
When he first saw her, he was just mesmerized, like, oh my gosh, she's beautiful. It was kind of, mystical because neither one of us really had many friends or girlfriends from Mayfield High School.
Hey, come on, let's go, dude. Let's go. Come on, let's go. Come on, let's go, bud. Let's go. Get in the truck. Don't worry about it, guys. It's good. Let's go. We're getting out of here. I'll be back. Get in the truck.
Eventually, Pad and Kim end up at the same house party.
We were drinking beers and whatnot, whatever. It was high school, it was harmless high school fun.
I'm gonna get another beer.
Yeah, sure you are.
Pad and Kim were gone. Like, where did they go? And so I was looking for Pad, and I kind of grinned to myself thinking, oh, that dog, he's with Kim. They slipped off somewhere. And about that same time, the guy that she was there at the party with was looking for Kim.
You lose something, dude? Huh? You lose a little something? Looking around, man? Yeah.
It's like, where is she? Where did she go? She's with Pad. And then, of course, me being there with Pad really kind of escalated things.
Come on, dude. Come on. What?
So we ended up getting into this, I don't want to say a brawl, but there were boys, teenage boys, fist fighting with each other over this.
We're waiting, dude. You lose something, dude? Huh? You lose a little something? Looking around, man?
Think that's about us?
I hope so. If it is, that means we're doing something right.
That's when they started seeing each other. And that's when things went from high school relationship and went from there.
They became pretty serious pretty fast. Let's get out of here. He thought that she was just the greatest thing that ever happened to him.
The pair defy expectations and make their relationship last beyond high school. While Pad goes to college, Kim is a driven career woman.
She was a hardworking girl, Right out of high school, I believe, she went to work for a company that sold computers, and she was very successful. She did really good. She bought herself a really nice car, and she wore very nice suits.
I look gorgeous.
I think she probably had to be making $100,000 a year back in the late 80s, early 90s, as a single woman.
Where to, patty cake?
How about Timbuktu?
I think Pad was impressed with her ability to earn that kind of money on her own.
Come on, give me the keys.
Okay.
I have a surprise for you, Kim.
Oh, mysterious.
They'd been together at that point for 5 years. And, after 5 or 6 years, you usually take the next step.
All right, close your eyes.
I'm gonna take you someplace real special.
But at the couple's wedding reception, it becomes even clearer that Kim and Pad are from two different worlds.
I think the two families, the Guffeys and Kim's family, was like oil and water coming together. Pad came from a fairly well-off family. They drilled water wells, agricultural and commercial, geothermal, all big wells. And in southern New Mexico, water's a very hot commodity. It's the desert, but they weren't flashy. It was very old money.
She came from, lesser means. She wasn't, her family didn't have a business of their own that was, passed on for generations.
Her dad worked for the electric company, so not broke, but not pulling in millions of dollars either.
Well, it's not quite what I was hoping for, but congratulations, Pat.
Thanks, Pop.
Just make sure they treat you right.
I think Pad's dad was a little apprehensive of her intentions, and I don't think he liked her. I think maybe the Guffeys always felt like Kim was looking for something, that she saw an opportunity with Pad.
Psychotherapist Stacy Kaiser and forensic psychologist Brian Russell see bumps in the road ahead.
Pat and Kim are basically from different worlds in the same community. He's rich and she's not, and that might not make a difference at all. However, at this young of an age, it's challenging to manage the fact that their parents aren't on their side.
I don't really understand why the parents on either side have these objections, but the fact that they do doesn't bode well for the relationship, because you want to have the extended family be supportive.
Pad and Kim shrug off their family's differences.
I think Pad loved Kim, and I think that he would have fought for her no matter what.
It's the two of them against the world.
Don't worry, I'll take care of it when I get home.
I'll take care of you when you get home.
But soon, it will be the two of them against each other.
Nobody likes your wife out with another man.
If Pad wasn't giving her the attention she was going to get it someplace else.
Opposites Pad Guffey and Kim Hansen are newly married and are trying to take the next steps together.
Nothing, again.
Look, trying is the fun part.
There's no time for fun. We both have to work.
If I can't give you a baby, how about a new house?
How about both?
Okay. Both it is.
While Kim climbs the corporate ladder, Pad joins his father's company.
Their cars got a little nicer, things got a little fancier, trips got a little bit more frequent, money was flowing a little bit better, things were doing very well.
But then tragedy strikes. Pad's father is killed suddenly in an on-site work accident.
It crushed Pad pretty severely. But I think there was a lot of pressure on Pad to take over the business. And being an only child, it was expected for him to do that.
It's nice to see you again.
Sorry about your dad.
Kim agrees to join the firm at his side.
There's someone I'd like to introduce you to.
I don't know that that was really her dream. At first, I think that she submersed herself into it and went full-fledged. But I think eventually it started to wear on her.
Hi, Bruce. Nice to meet you. I've heard so much. Can't wait to get started.
She wanted something way more glamorous and probably way more fashionable than to be a well driller.
Will you, excuse us for a moment? What is this about?
She traded the engagement ring that he gave her for one of her choice, and didn't tell him, didn't mention it to him, didn't discuss it with him until after the fact.
Honey, it's just a little upgrade.
A little upgrade? We should have talked about this.
It's my ring. I'm the one who has to wear it.
I know it hurt him. I know it bothered him. Like, what I gave her wasn't enough.
When I see Kim take back the original diamond and trade up for a larger one, I'm surprised and concerned. I'm surprised because Kim is the one in the couple who comes from the more modest background.
I think the message she's sending is, what you gave me isn't good enough. I don't really care how you feel. I care about how I feel, and I'm going to feel better with a bigger ring.
This is the first time I see something that suggests to me that she is pretty materialistic. And for somebody like Pad, I think that should be pretty concerning, given that he's the one that's coming into the marriage with the greater resources.
Despite his hurt feelings, Pad eventually gives Kim what she's always wanted, a baby boy they name Cody.
He loved his son. He worshiped his son. He thought he was amazing, but he wasn't a super hands-on dad.
Okay.
I'll do it.
No,
The new baby seems to drive the couple even further apart.
Fine. Guess I'll go to work then.
Having children changes the dynamic in any relationship.
She obviously wore the pants in the relationship, or at least that's the way I felt.
While Kim takes care of their son, Pad's money helps buy the growing family a place in the gated community of Messia.
Where the hell are you?
Hello?
Patrick Duffy, it is our moving day.
And you're not here.
When they built the new house and they moved in, Pad was supposed to be there for the movers, but they went to play golf.
Yeah, I'm coming home soon.
It seems giving his family a beautiful house also gives Pad license to do what he likes.
You're supposed to be here. I have to go pick up Cody in 20 minutes, and I am alone and surrounded by boxes.
Don't worry, I'll take care of it when I get home.
I'll take care of you when you get home.
It is possible that she felt that he was neglecting his family life.
Are you there? Are you there?
If my husband went golfing on our moving date, I would probably be very upset.
I mean, of course, he wanted a beautiful wife and a beautiful home. Of course, I think expectation also was to be happy, and I don't think he was.
And that lack of happiness is just the first stop on the road to marital hell.
Sometimes it's not what you do, it's how it looks.
I know it went nuclear in about 2 seconds.
Pad and Kim Guffey seem to love the perfect life they've made together, but they're struggling to stay in love.
Hey!
Pad's behavior is not helping.
I am gonna make a toast.
Pad kind of had a fascination with strip clubs.
To old friends and new deals. Cheers, boys.
He blames the demands of his job.
The way they did business with these farmers, they would sit around and they'd drink beer all night or drink whiskey all night or whatever it was. But that's how you did business. And there were a lot of deals made like that.
We're gonna have another round.
Why are you even here?
Because I have clients. Oh, you wanna know why? When's the last time we had sex? When's the last time you touched me?
You think acting like this is gonna warm me up?
Warm you up? Please.
On more than one occasion, he told me that sex was non-existent.
With their marriage faltering, Kim explores the idea of starting a new design business.
So, I was thinking something a little more bold for your office.
Just Kim, you have great taste.
And takes on a new client, Georgie.
She did the designs for his house, and it was like a little bit unusual how much time and effort she put into that.
Georgie had a thing for her. You could see it. I mean, he was obvious about it.
I should go.
Only after I show you the upholstery in the study.
I really don't know what was going on between Georgie and Kim, but it was suspicious.
Hey, man. Yeah, I just saw her with Georgie. What do I do?
There was more than one occasion that he wanted to know what he should do, to the point of tears. I mean, like cried. I mean, we cried it out on the phone.
Things come to a head on Kim's 36th birthday.
So Pat's gonna throw her birthday party. He rents the bar for a Friday night.
Hi, you came.
Georgie shows up. I'm not sure how he got in. I know Pat didn't invite him. So he pulls her chair out. On one side, I'm just looking at him like, God, you're such a weasel.
Whiskey, tonic with a lime twist for the lady.
You remembered.
He orders for her. I'm like, hey, boy, you're not on a date. That's Pat's wife.
Absolutely.
Pat's not that happy about that.
Amazing. I can't believe it.
Georgie.
Hey!
Yeah.
Hey! The hell are you doing here?
Your wife invited me.
Look, you're gonna leave now or I'm gonna kick your ass.
I like to see you try.
So people get in the way. The bouncer goes to throw Pat out. So he gets thrown out of this party he paid for.
He did get kicked out of the bar that night.
This is my freaking party. How did you get home?
None of your business.
Actually, it is. Remember, I'm your husband.
How dare you make a scene at my birthday?
How dare you make a scene around town with Georgie?
I told him specifically, you should appeal to her and say, listen, I love you. You're my wife. I'm asking you to stop. I don't think that anything's going on inappropriately, but people are starting to talk, and it's embarrassing me.
I don't want you seeing that weasel ever again, you hear me?
Then tone down your drinking and never go to a strip club again. And I mean never.
That's fair.
But you're still sleeping on the couch tonight.
So, like, pretty much every other night in this house.
Kim and Pat's relationship has soured sexually. And that doesn't surprise me because I think it's hard for a woman to feel sexy about a guy whom she doesn't respect. And Pat is behaving in some ways that are not worthy of respect. He's spending a lot of time out drinking with clients. He's going to strip clubs with clients. And at the same time, Kim is behaving in ways that I think are inappropriate with Georgie also, and it seems to me almost like she's using that as kind of a bargaining chip. Like maybe then we can come to an agreement that you'll stop doing that and I'll stop doing this.
At this point, it really looks like their relationship is deteriorating. And yet, when things begin to come to a head and they have a fight about this, and they both decide they're gonna get rid of those outside relationships, I begin to see some hope for them. They're actually coming together as a team, and they're working together to solve their problems.
Pat keeps his promise. For a while.
Pat came home late at night after a night of drinking, and Kim was waiting up, ready to pounce.
Where were you? said, where were you?
Clients.
Farmers don't drink until 3 in the morning.
Fine. You want to know where I was? I was with somebody else.
With?
I had sex with somebody else.
Pad's decision to have a one-night stand was based on his lack of physicality with his wife. I'm sure she absolutely flipped her lid. I know it went nuclear in about 2 seconds. Knowing what I know of his relationship with Kim, I understand why he did it, but I also know it was a one-time thing.
One 4th of July, the couple's friends realize the marriage isn't just volatile, it's explosive.
Pad said, oh, well, let's just all come to the house and we'll do a big 4th of July thing. I mean, it was kind of last minute.
He said, I'm gonna make ribs, and he had this big plan. Well, he hadn't talked to Kim.
We're not having a party.
It's too late, it's on.
So cancel
What?
the party.
No.
Call everyone and cancel it.
I said no.
Do it! Call them and cancel
Stop.
the party!
Stop it.
The party!
Stop it. Fine. Have it your way, bitch.
I finally got it out of him. I said, what happened? He's like, she absolutely flipped out and went mental. She had a hanger in her hand and she was smacking him with the hanger on his back. And he had welts all over his back. Through good times and bad times, I think he loved her and he hated her at the same time.
But love and hate can be a lethal mix.
There was a very small puncture wound.
Screw you.
It was probably the only way that he could hurt her.
After the fights between Pad and Kim Guffey escalate to the point of violence, the two keep their distance from one another.
They probably had gotten to a point in their relationship where maybe they were at different places.
Kim focuses on a new friendship with a parent from their son Cody's bowling league.
He was divorced. He had at least one child that was Pat and Kim's son's age. They knew each other's kids from the bowling alley, and they started a flirtatious kind of relationship. They got to the point where they started just talking friendly by instant messaging each other, calling each other beautiful and handsome, and talking about their own personal desires.
Let's get you ready for the game.
I want a divorce.
Fine. But if you leave me, I will take you for everything.
Screw you.
If there had been a divorce, for all intents and purposes, it would have been divided up 50-50. That would have been devastating to his business and a big economic loss.
He was really hung up on the fact that I've worked really hard for a long time, and I'll be damned if I'm going to give her half of what I've earned. And that's how he felt. He went to 2 or 3 attorneys in Las Cruces and gave them $5,000 retainers and said, "You are now my attorney, so that she comes, you cannot represent her."
She had worked for the business. She had been a stay-at-home mom. She probably was entitled to a lot of that money, but I think it was probably the only way that he could hurt her.
Things have really escalated with Pat and Kim. It's reached a point where divorce is being discussed, lawyers are being retained, there's threats about money.
It seems like Kim has kind of used this style consistently, where she's kind of gone from 0 to 60 fast when she's gotten upset about things. Pad seems like in the beginning of their marriage, he was a little bit more of an acquiescer, but now over time, he seems to have sort of almost adopted her style, and that makes me think that he's built up a bunch of pent-up rage.
As far as I'm concerned, there is no hope left. This relationship is going to end. The question is, who's going to end it and how?
During a weekend visit from Pad's mom, tension is at an all-time high.
Something wrong? Everything's fine, except for the fact that your son is out golfing.
Kim was upset at Pad because he didn't stay home and entertain his mom.
It really was just an excuse to be in a fight.
Kim.
Oh my God! Oh my God!
Ambulance.
Oh my...
Call an ambulance.
What happened?
I fell on a bridge.
You have reached 911 emergency. I have an emergency.
My husband fell. He's bleeding from the chest.
I don't know. He had something and he fell.
It went into his chest. Please hurry.
Kim.
Oh, baby.
Water. Kim. Kim.
What city are you in?
Yes, we're in Mesilla. Please hurry.
I need an ambulance fast. Give me 1 second, okay? I've got to page up the units, okay? Don't hang up.
Please hurry.
First responders and police from the Mesilla Marshal's office arrive on scene.
Tell him what happened.
I think I fell on a branch. I fell on a branch.
He was awake and at least trying to communicate. He was really thirsty. He was really upset. He did say that he fell.
It just so happens the puncture hit a crucial point.
It went through 2 of his ribs and then just went right into the heart. So he was declared dead fairly quickly after getting up to the hospital.
I get a telephone call from my mom, who still lives in Las Cruces, and says, you know, Pad's dead. And I'm like, what? I couldn't even process it. And at the time, I'm thinking, impaled? What does that mean? He's been impaled. You know, it was just this tragic accident. We don't know what happened. Like, was he landscaping? Was he on, like, a cherry picker? Like, was he on the rig? Like, how do you fall on a tree branch?
The death is recorded as accidental. But out of standard procedure, detectives from the larger urban police force are called in.
So, take me through your morning. Did you see Pat?
I was asleep when he went to work. I got up a bit later, dropped my son off at school, and then came home to work out. We exchanged a few texts, but nothing special. I mean, I didn't even know he was home. And I came into the kitchen to make a smoothie.
She says that he surprised her when he walked in and that he already had this injury.
Kim!
Oh my God!
Ambulance.
Oh my God! What happened? And I could see blood coming out of his shirt, but it didn't look that bad.
She just didn't realize that he was hurt that bad. He tends to overreact, she tells them. And then, of course, he dies. And she's very cooperative.
I cleaned up a bit.
She cleaned up the blood because the son would be coming home, and she didn't want him to see that. He was going to have to be told that his dad had died, and so they didn't want him to have more trauma.
Do you mind if I just look around a bit?
Be my guest.
The investigators weren't able to locate a branch or any type of equipment that he was using for yard work. It does raise suspicion as to what truly happened or where that object is at.
Could he have been stabbed with something else?
Like what?
There was a letter opener there just the other night.
It's starting to look less and less like an accident.
Even with the things that I knew about their relationship, I still was absolutely dumbfounded.
Pat Guffey is dead in an apparent fluke accident when he falls on a branch and it goes through his heart. But investigators start to doubt the story told by Pat's wife, Kim, after one of his employees says they saw him around 10 a.m. on the day of his death. Kim is interviewed another time and is asked again about her communication with Pat that morning.
So you were just texting Pat that morning?
Actually, I think we talked on the phone. It was kind of a long call. It might have been about 20 minutes, maybe.
She realizes that they were going to get the phone logs, and so she has to now clarify that lie. And so she does admit that they were on the phone. So there's back and forth conversations.
He was angry with me. He'd heard some gossip, and he was upset. Hello?
Are you alone?
What?
You heard me. Is there someone there with you right now?
Of course not.
You're lying.
If you're lying right now, I swear I'm gonna hurt myself.
He hung up on me. Maybe he tried to hurt himself to prove a point.
Nothing is adding up. So authorities interview the emergency dispatch operator to ask for her impressions of the 911 call.
Yes, hello? What's going on? I have an emergency, please. My husband got hurt and he's bleeding in the chest.
The 911 operator informed us that we should listen to the whole 911 tape.
Every time anyone calls 911, it automatically starts recording while the phone is ringing.
At that point, I think I had 17 or 18 years of being a prosecutor here in Doña Ana County, and I never knew that they tape recorded when it was ringing.
Please don't send me to the cops. I fell, please. Will you promise me? Please promise. Please stop. Lay down and calm down. In the car, please don't send me to the cops. Okay. I am. I fell, please. Will you promise me? Please promise? Please stop. Lay down and calm down. Lay down on your back, baby. Lay down. I know it. I know it. I know it. I'm going in. Oh, you have reached 911 emergency. I have an emergency. The gas cord. Please hurry. A high volume of my husband is bleeding. I don't want you to die, baby. Calm down. Lay down and relax. What can I do? 911 operator will be on the line as soon as possible. I know, baby. Operador tomará su llamada lo más pronto posible.
You're listening to it, you hear that slip up at the very beginning where she says, I just stabbed my husband. And of course, it's in the car. Please don't tell anyone. She's talking about the weapon that she used to stab him, that she had put it in the car and that it was not in the house, so nobody was going to see it. Please tell him it was an accident.
With that call, investigators have a good idea of what may have happened that tragic morning. Kim and Pad start fighting after Pad becomes suspicious his wife isn't home alone.
Hello?
So, are you alone?
What?
You heard me!
Is there someone there with you?
Something made him get in the car and go there on the spot.
Kim, don't me. Is there
someone there with you?
Actually, he just left.
She was telling him about a relationship she was having, an emotional type affair, if you will. And I think that he went home to confront that and see if it was true.
I'm done. You're not getting a thing.
Oh, really?
There isn't a lawyer in town that can save you.
You were the one that cheated, remember? Lawyers are gonna have a field day with that one. Wait, where are you?
Closer than you think.
Good. Because I'm gonna take you for everything.
Like hell you are. You have no right to take anything from me. What did you do?
Oh my God, I'm so sorry.
Call for help. Get an ambulance. Where are you going?
We do believe, based on the nature of the crime, the size difference, that she had to attack him fairly quickly and very unexpectedly, because otherwise Pad would have been able to fight her off. So it was an ambush. She stabs him, pulls it out, then takes time to go out to the car, moves the weapon and puts it out there, and then calls 911.
Where did you? Where did you put it?
In the car, please don't send it to the car.
Promise me.
Lay down on your back, baby. Lay down.
I'm going to...
If you listen to what he's saying when he's yelling at her, please call for help, please get me help, I'm thirsty. Like, I think he thought she wasn't really calling for help. I think he did not believe that she was even on the phone. How long he laid there and watched her run around and do all these things to cover up that she just stabbed him must have been even more terrifying than being stabbed.
I fell on the bridge.
Even in his dying moments, Pad lied to protect Kim.
If she would have left the weapon in there, if she would have called immediately, and if she would have gotten help instead of trying to protect herself and trying to hide up the crime, I think he would have had probably a 90% chance of surviving.
Kim Guffey is arrested and eventually pleads guilty to involuntary manslaughter and tampering with evidence.
They kept calling it nonviolent involuntary manslaughter, and I'm like, how is getting stabbed in the chest nonviolent?
If a man was to just say, oh, I just lost my temper and I just grabbed a hanger and hit the woman with it, we would never accept that. Because to me, it sent the message to our community that if you are a female and you can play the role of a victim, with that you can get away with being punished with less than a year in prison for taking somebody's life.
Do I think that Kim knew exactly where to stab and intended to stab exactly in that place on Pad to kill him? No, I really don't. That said, I think she intended to stab him, and that created a gross risk of lethality.
There's a lot of possible theories for why Pad might have said that he stabbed himself. I think he wanted to divorce her, and maybe in his mind he thought he would live and he would end the marriage and she would never be able to do something like this to him again.
If there's one thing that I've learned through this whole thing, is that honestly, anybody's capable of doing something like this. Even with the things that I knew about her relationship, I still was absolutely dumbfounded. There were warning signs and nobody addressed them. Nobody did anything. You don't know what to do. The way that everything went down, it's really tragic. And honestly, from the perspective of Pad, he deserves a voice.
There's a lot that I would have liked to have shared with him and told him that's happened to me and my family and his family in the last 8 years that I wish he were here for. He didn't deserve what he got. I have a hard time, I can't take his name. I can't take his name out of my phone because then I feel like he's gone.
The rain fell hard over Ciudad de Mexico on the night she vanished, turning the streets into mirrors of flickering neon and police lights that would not arrive until it was too late. In 1995, the headlines would call it a mysterious disappearance, a young woman swallowed by the city's endless roar, another name in a metropolis that never truly sleeps. But behind the noise and the smog, behind the crowded buses and the late-night Ticarius, there was a silence that no one could explain, a silence that began in a small apartment in Colonia Narvard and spread like a stain across an entire community. Her name was Elena Vargas, 24 years old, a law student with a reputation for stubborn honesty, the kind of person who asked questions others were afraid to voice. On a Thursday evening in October, she told her mother she would be home before midnight. She was never seen again. The first reports were routine. Missing person. Last seen leaving the university library. Dark hair tied back, denim jacket, a folder clutched under her arm. Friends described her as focused, ambitious, not the type to disappear without a word. The family waited through the night, calling hospitals, dialing friends, pacing the narrow hallway of their building as the hours ticked by. By morning, the city had already moved on, but inside that apartment the air felt frozen. When police finally stepped in, they found nothing extraordinary. No signs of forced entry at her home. No ransom call. No dramatic struggle in the street. Just a young woman who seemed to have dissolved into thin air. Then came the first strange clue. A taxi driver claimed he had picked her up near Avenida Universidad. He remembered her because she seemed agitated, glancing over her shoulder as if someone was following her. He dropped her off near a construction site that had long been abandoned, a skeletal concrete structure looming against the skyline. Why she would go there at that hour made no sense. Investigators searched the site, combing through debris, questioning night guards from nearby buildings. They found a single earring in the dust, silver, shaped like a small crescent moon. Her mother confirmed it was hers. The press seized on the detail. Strange clue discovered. Cold case in the making. The days stretched into weeks. Witnesses contradicted each other. A street vendor swore he saw her arguing with a man in a dark sedan. Another insisted she boarded a bus heading south. Surveillance cameras were rare in 1995, and the few that existed offered grainy, useless images. Detectives faced a city of nearly 20 million, each alley and rooftop a potential hiding place. They questioned classmates, professors, former boyfriends. One name surfaced repeatedly, Ricardo Mina, a local businessman in his 30s, known for his connections and his temper. Rumors whispered that Elena had been investigating something, perhaps for a class project, perhaps for reasons of her own. Allegations of corruption linked to real estate deals, bribes paid to officials to clear land for development. The abandoned construction site where her earring was found was rumored to be one of Mina's stalled projects. Ricardo denied everything. He admitted knowing Elena casually, claimed she had once interviewed him about urban development. He provided an alibi for the night she disappeared, a dinner with associates at an upscale restaurant in Polanco. Waiters confirmed he was there, at least for part of the evening. Without physical evidence, without a body, prosecutors had nothing solid. The case stalled. Headlines shifted to other tragedies, other scandals. Yet in Colonia Narvard, candles still burned on the windowsill of the Vargas apartment. Community shock hardened into quiet fear. Parents warned daughters to come home early. University students organized marches demanding justice. The phrase cold case began to appear in editorials, a label that felt like surrender. Years passed. The abandoned construction site was eventually demolished, replaced by a modern office complex of glass and steel. Elena's posters faded from telephone poles, her smile bleached by sun and rain. Detectives retired. Files gathered dust in metal cabinets. Her mother aged rapidly, attending every vigil, clutching the remaining crescent moon earring, as if it were a relic. Every so often, a tip would surface. A supposed sighting in another state. An anonymous call claiming she had been kidnapped by a trafficking ring. Each lead dissolved under scrutiny. The mystery deepened, not because of new evidence, but because of the absence of it. It was as if the city itself had conspired to forget. Then, nearly 3 decades later, the call came. In 2023, a man walked into a regional prosecutor's office in Puebla, hundreds of kilometers from where the story began. His hair was gray, his shoulders hunched, his hands trembling as he asked to speak to an investigator about an old disappearance in Ciudad de Mexico. His name was Ricardo Mina, the same businessman once questioned and released. The same man who had built a small empire in real estate, who had attended charity galas and posed for photographs beside politicians. He said he could no longer sleep. He said he had carried a secret since 1995. And then, in a statement that would ignite the nation, he confessed. According to his account, Elena had confronted him about fraudulent permits and illegal payments connected to that abandoned construction site. She threatened to expose documents she had uncovered through university contacts. He claimed he panicked. On the night she disappeared, he followed her from campus, intercepting her before she could meet a journalist friend. He persuaded her to get into his car under the pretense of clarifying a misunderstanding. They drove to the empty building, where an argument escalated into violence. He described pushing her in a moment of rage, her head striking a concrete beam. He insisted he never intended to kill her. But when she lay motionless on the dusty floor, fear overtook him. Instead of calling for help, he called 2 trusted employees. What followed was a calculated cover-up. He and the employees transported her body in the trunk of a sedan, driving through the night to a remote ravine outside the city. There, he claimed, they buried her in shallow soil beneath scrub and stone. Over time, erosion and construction in the area may have disturbed the grave, he said. He offered maps, approximate coordinates, fragments of memory that had haunted him for decades. Investigators listened in stunned silence. The cold case that had defined a generation was suddenly alive again, propelled by a confession that seemed both detailed and disturbingly rehearsed. Excavation teams were dispatched to the location he described. For days, cameras broadcast live images of forensic experts sifting through earth under a merciless sun. The community that had once marched as students now watched as parents. Elena's mother, frail but resolute, sat in a folding chair near the perimeter tape. When human remains were finally uncovered, the air shifted. Dental records confirmed what the nation feared and expected. The bones belonged to Elena Vargas. After 28 years, the mysterious disappearance had a body, a place, a brutal explanation. Yet, even in confession, questions lingered. Why now? Why confess after building a life of apparent success? Some speculated financial troubles had eroded his defenses. Others suggested illness, a diagnosis that forced him to confront mortality. In his statement, he spoke of guilt like a physical weight, a presence in every room, in every handshake, in every groundbreaking ceremony for projects that rose from land he once controlled through deceit. He described hearing her voice in the echo of construction sites, seeing her face in the reflective glass of new buildings. Whether remorse or strategy drove him, the effect was seismic. The phrase cold case resuelto dominated headlines, paired with words like confession tardia and verdad estremecedora. The two employees he implicated were located and arrested. They denied involvement at first, but forensic analysis of old company vehicles and financial records supported parts of Ricardo's narrative. Investigators uncovered archived documents linking him to bribery schemes eerily similar to what Elena had reportedly discovered. The motive that once seemed speculative now appeared chillingly plausible. A young law student had stumbled onto a network of corruption, and her determination to expose it had sealed her fate. For the Vargas family, the confession brought a collision of grief and relief. The endless uncertainty that had defined nearly 3 decades was replaced by a grim clarity. No more imagined scenarios of survival in distant cities. No more midnight calls raising false hope. Instead, there was a grave to visit, a name to engrave on stone, a story that could finally be told without the word missing attached to it. Yet closure proved elusive. Knowing how she died did not erase the years stolen, the birthdays marked by absence, the quiet dinners where her chair remained empty. In Colonia Narvarte, neighbors who once whispered about the case now spoke openly about the corruption that had shadowed their community. Younger residents, born after 1995, learned the story as a cautionary tale, a reminder that power unchecked can silence truth for years. The modern office complex that stands where the abandoned site once loomed now feels different to those who remember. Glass walls reflect more than sunlight. They mirror a past that refuses to disappear completely. Ricardo Mina awaits sentencing, his once confident posture replaced by the stoop of a man confronting the wreckage of his choices. In court, he repeats that he is sorry, that he never meant for it to go so far. But the words echo hollow against the weight of nearly 3 decades of denial. The cold case that haunted Ciudad de Mexico for a generation has been resolved on paper, yet its impact lingers in quieter ways. It lingers in the cautious glances of students walking home at night, in the renewed scrutiny of development deals, in the knowledge that truth can be buried but not erased. As the city moves forward, as traffic surges and new towers rise, there is a lingering memory of that rainy night in 1995 when a young woman stepped into the darkness and did not return. Her story, once a headline fading into archives, now stands as a testament to persistence, to the painful endurance of families who refuse to forget. The confession may have revealed a truth long concealed, but it also exposed the fragility of justice when power and fear intertwine. And in the echo of her name, carried through crowded streets and courtrooms alike, there remains a quiet warning. Even the deepest secrets, even the coldest cases, can resurface when conscience finally breaks its silence. The confession did not end the story. It detonated a second wave of shock that rippled across Ciudad de Mexico with the force of a delayed explosion. Courtrooms filled before sunrise, reporters lined the steps with microphones raised like weapons, and the phrase cold case resolved was repeated so often it began to sound unreal. Yet beneath the headlines, investigators moved quickly, aware that a confession after 28 years is both a breakthrough and a battleground. Ricardo Mina's words were detailed, but details can be crafted, polished by memory and self-interest. Prosecutors needed more than remorse. They needed proof that could survive cross-examination and the scrutiny of a public that had learned to distrust power. Forensic teams returned to the ravine where Elena's remains were found, expanding the perimeter in search of overlooked evidence. Soil samples were analyzed, fragments of fabric examined under high-powered microscopes, every trace measured against the timeline Ricardo described. They discovered remnants of a tarp embedded with fibers matching those used by one of his former construction companies in the mid-1990s. Old payroll records confirmed that 2 employees he named had been on duty the week of the disappearance, despite their claims of being elsewhere. Phone logs from archived billing systems, preserved in dusty storage facilities, showed late-night calls between Ricardo and his site manager on the night Elena vanished. Each piece alone was circumstantial. Together they formed a tightening net. The employees, Javier Salgado and Martín Ibarra, faced renewed interrogation. At first, they portrayed themselves as minor figures. men who followed orders without knowing the consequences. But when confronted with evidence of the tarp and the calls, cracks appeared. Javier admitted he had driven a company truck to the construction site that night, claiming he thought they were moving materials to avoid theft. Martín acknowledged helping load a heavy object into the trunk of Ricardo's sedan, insisting he never saw a body. Their partial admissions only deepened the horror. What had once been a single act of violence now revealed itself as a coordinated cover-up, a chain of choices that prioritized loyalty and fear over humanity. As the legal process unfolded, the media revisited every aspect of 1995, replaying archival footage of marches and candlelight vigils. Former classmates spoke of Elena's determination, recalling how she had once challenged a professor about ethical responsibilities in public service. They described her as relentless when she believed something was wrong, unwilling to accept evasive answers. That trait, once admired, now seemed tragically prophetic. Journalists uncovered old notes from her apartment, pages filled with references to permit numbers and land registry entries linked to Ricardo's projects. Though the documents she allegedly intended to expose were never fully recovered, the fragments suggested she had indeed been closing in on irregularities. The defense team attempted to reframe the narrative. They argued that Ricardo's confession was the product of deteriorating mental health, that guilt had distorted his memory. They suggested the possibility of accidental death without intent, pushing for a reduced charge. They questioned the reliability of evidence collected decades after the fact, pointing to potential contamination and lost records. But prosecutors countered with the consistency between Ricardo's statement and the physical findings at the ravine, emphasizing that he had provided coordinates unknown to the public. The courtroom became a theater of competing truths, each side aware that the outcome would set a precedent for other long-dormant cases. Beyond the legal arguments, the emotional weight pressed heavily on the Vargas family. Elena's mother, now in her 70s, attended every hearing despite frail health. She listened as lawyers dissected her daughter's final moments with clinical precision, transforming a life into exhibits and timelines. Supporters filled the benches behind her, many of them strangers who had followed the case for years. They carried photographs of Elena at 24, her expression frozen in youthful determination. Outside, activists held signs demanding broader investigations into corruption that had thrived in the 1990s. For them, this was not just about one confession. It was about a system that allowed influence to shield wrongdoing for nearly 3 decades. The revelation also prompted a review of other unsolved disappearances from the same era. Authorities reopened files, searching for patterns linked to development projects and political alliances. Though no direct connections were immediately established, the renewed scrutiny signaled a shift. The phrase community shock evolved into community reckoning. Citizens demanded transparency in municipal contracts, pushing for digital archives to prevent future evidence from vanishing into forgotten warehouses. The ghost of 1995 began influencing policies in 2023, a reminder that unresolved crimes cast long administrative shadows. Inside the prison where Ricardo awaited trial, he reportedly kept to himself, declining interviews, spending hours writing letters that were never sent. Sources close to the case suggested he expressed fear not of punishment, but of public hatred. Yet for many, hatred had long been replaced by exhaustion. The city had endured countless scandals since Elena's disappearance, each eroding trust incrementally. Her case stood out because it spanned generations, because it represented a promise broken not just to a family, but to an entire community that believed justice, though delayed, would eventually arrive. When the trial formally began, prosecutors laid out a meticulous chronology. They described how Ricardo's real estate ventures were under pressure in 1995, facing regulatory scrutiny that threatened financial collapse. They argued that Elena's inquiries posed a direct risk to his operations, and that eliminating her was a desperate attempt to preserve his empire. They presented expert testimony on head trauma consistent with the injuries inferred from her skeletal remains, aligning with his account of a fatal push. They highlighted inconsistencies in the employees' earlier statements, painting a picture of coordinated deception. Each day in court peeled back another layer of denial that had protected him for years. The defense sought to humanize Ricardo, portraying him as a flawed man crushed by guilt. They emphasized his voluntary confession, suggesting it demonstrated genuine remorse. They called character witnesses who described his philanthropic activities, his donations to schools and hospitals. But the prosecution countered that charity could not erase a calculated burial in a ravine, nor the decades of silence that followed. The jury listened, aware that their decision would echo beyond a single defendant. As weeks passed, the narrative that began with a mysterious disappearance transformed into a cautionary chronicle of power, fear, and delayed accountability. The once abandoned construction site, now a gleaming office tower, became a symbol frequently referenced in editorials. Commentators spoke of foundations built on secrets, of glass facades reflecting unresolved histories. Elena's story infiltrated university lectures on ethics and law, cited as a real-world example of the consequences when corruption intersects with youthful idealism. Finally, the verdict day arrived. The courtroom was silent as the foreperson stood. Ricardo Mina was found guilty of homicide and obstruction of justice. Javier Salgado and Martín Ibarra were convicted as accomplices in the concealment of a body. The sentences were severe, reflecting not only the crime but the prolonged evasion of responsibility. When the judge spoke of the impact on the Vargas family and the community, his words carried a weight that transcended legal language. Justice, he acknowledged, had been delayed, but it had not been extinguished. Outside, applause mixed with tears. Elena's mother embraced supporters, her expression a complex blend of relief and lingering sorrow. She told reporters that no sentence could return her daughter, but knowing the truth allowed her to breathe differently, to sleep without imagining endless possibilities. The cold case that once symbolized helplessness now stood as proof that time does not always protect the guilty. Yet even as the legal chapter closed, the emotional aftermath continued. The city resumed its relentless pace, traffic surging through avenues that had witnessed both her disappearance and the protests that followed. Young law students walked past the courthouse where her case was decided, aware that one of their own had once challenged power and paid the ultimate price. In community centers, discussions about civic responsibility gained urgency. Parents spoke to their children about courage and caution in equal measure. The ravine where her remains were found has since been marked with a modest plaque bearing her name and the years 1971 to 1995. Visitors leave flowers and handwritten notes, small gestures against the vast landscape that once concealed a secret. The site is quiet now, but it carries the echo of a confession that shattered decades of uncertainty. In the end, the story of Ciudad de Mexico 1995 cold case resolved is not solely about a crime uncovered. It is about the endurance of memory in a city prone to forgetting. It is about the belief that even in a metropolis of millions, one voice can matter, one disappearance can demand answers, and one delayed confession can reshape the narrative of justice for an entire generation. Long after the verdict was read and the courtroom emptied, the echoes of Elena Vargas's name continued to move through Ciudad de Mexico like a low, unrelenting current beneath the surface of daily life. The case was officially closed, stamped and archived with the finality of a judicial seal, yet closure felt like a word too clean, too precise for the damage left behind. In the neighborhoods that had once plastered her photograph on lampposts, conversations shifted from outrage to introspection. How had a young law student's disappearance been allowed to fade into background noise for so many years? How had influence and intimidation quietly steered an investigation away from uncomfortable truths? The answers were no longer theoretical. They were written in court transcripts, in financial ledgers, in the confession of a man who once believed himself untouchable. Ricardo Mina's sentencing marked a public reckoning, but inside prison walls his story took on a different tone. Reports emerged of his declining health, of sleepless nights and isolation. Some said he had begun meeting with a prison counselor, speaking at length about the moment in 1995 when anger overtook reason. Whether those conversations were acts of genuine remorse or attempts to ease his conscience, no one could say. What remained undeniable was that his empire had collapsed. Properties were seized to compensate the Vargas family, business partners distanced themselves, and political figures who once posed beside him issued statements condemning his actions. The transformation was stark. A man who once shaped skylines now existed behind concrete and steel, stripped of influence, defined solely by a crime he had hidden for nearly 3 decades. For Javier Salgado and Martín Ibarra, the consequences were equally severe. Their families faced scrutiny, their children confronted whispers at school. They had lived for years with a shared secret, convincing themselves that silence equaled survival. In court, they admitted fear had driven their obedience, fear of losing jobs, fear of retaliation, fear of a powerful employer. That fear had chained them to a lie that grew heavier with time. The narrative of the case expanded beyond a single act of violence, revealing a network of complicity sustained by intimidation and ambition. It forced the public to confront an uncomfortable reality. Crimes of power rarely thrive alone. They depend on silence, on bystanders who look away. The Vargas family, meanwhile, began the slow process of redefining life after truth. Elena's mother visited the ravine regularly, sitting beside the plaque that now bore her daughter's name. She spoke softly, as if continuing conversations interrupted in 1995. Those close to her said she no longer asked why. Instead, she spoke about who Elena had been, about her laughter, her stubbornness, her belief that the law could be a tool for justice rather than manipulation. The shift from questioning to remembering marked a subtle but profound change. Grief remained, but it was no longer suspended in uncertainty. It had form, context, a beginning and an end. Universities across the city incorporated Elena's story into ethics courses and legal seminars. Professors referenced her determination as both inspiration and warning. Students debated the responsibilities of confronting corruption, weighing courage against personal risk. Her name appeared in academic papers examining cold cases and delayed confessions, cited as an example of how time can both obscure and illuminate truth. The phrase mysterious disappearance gradually gave way to a more precise language: homicide, obstruction, systemic failure. Words that once floated in speculation were now anchored in evidence. The broader impact rippled through municipal institutions. Audits were conducted on dormant development projects from the 1990s. Archived permits were digitized, oversight committees strengthened. While no reform could rewrite the past, the case served as a catalyst, a stark demonstration of what unchecked influence could conceal. Activists who had marched as students in the late 1990s found themselves advising younger generations on sustaining pressure for transparency. The energy that once fueled candlelight vigils evolved into structured advocacy, into policy proposals and watchdog organizations determined to prevent history from repeating itself. Media outlets produced in-depth retrospectives, reconstructing the timeline from Elena's final walk out of the university library to the excavation of her remains decades later. Viewers watched reenactments of the abandoned construction site, now overlaid with graphics illustrating financial transactions and phone records. The narrative, once fragmented by rumor, now flowed with documented clarity. Yet each retelling carried an undercurrent of tragedy. No amount of investigative precision could restore the life interrupted at 24. In quieter moments, residents of Colonia Narvart reflected on how the case had shaped their perception of safety. Parents who once forbade daughters from walking alone at night now acknowledged that danger had not lurked in dark alleys alone, but in offices and boardrooms. The realization altered the community's understanding of threat. It was not merely random violence that haunted the city, it was calculated decisions made by individuals shielded by status. That awareness fostered a cautious vigilance, a determination to question authority rather than accept it at face value. As years continued to pass, the story of the Ciudad de Mexico 1995 cold case resolved stands as a layered testament to persistence. It is remembered not only for the confession that broke decades of silence, but for the collective endurance that kept Elena's name alive when official interest waned. Her mother's unwavering presence at vigils, the classmates who refused to let her photograph fade, the journalists who revisited dusty files. Each played a role in sustaining the memory that ultimately pressured truth into the open. The case underscores a stark lesson. Justice delayed is not justice denied if memory refuses to yield. At the ravine, seasonal rains reshape the soil, but the plaque remains fixed, a marker against erosion both literal and symbolic. Visitors continue to leave flowers, some too young to recall the original headlines, others who marched in the streets nearly 30 years ago. They stand in silence, contemplating the fragility of plans and the permanence of consequence. The wind moves through sparse vegetation, carrying with it the distant hum of a city in constant motion. Life continues, relentless and indifferent, yet marked by what occurred beneath its surface. Ricardo Mina's appeals process may stretch on, legal motions filed and contested, but the central truth is no longer in dispute. The mysterious disappearance that once perplexed investigators has been dissected, understood, judged. And still, understanding does not equate to healing. The Vargas family celebrates milestones with an empty chair present in spirit. Former classmates gather occasionally, recounting memories of study sessions and heated debates, imagining the career Elena might have built. Those imagined futures linger like shadows beside the tangible outcome. In the broader cultural memory of Ciudad de Mexico, the case occupies a distinct space. It is invoked when new allegations of corruption surface, when citizens demand accountability, when commentators warn against complacency. The phrase cold case resolved has become shorthand for the idea that time cannot permanently bury wrongdoing. It serves as both reassurance and caution, proof that conscience can crack even the most carefully constructed facade, and reminder that waiting decades for truth exacts a profound cost. As night falls over the city and lights ignite across high-rise windows, the skyline Ricardo once helped shape stands illuminated against the dark. Among those buildings is the office complex that replaced the abandoned site where Elena's confrontation turned fatal. Employees enter and exit each day, unaware perhaps of the ground's history. Yet history persists, woven invisibly into foundations and corridors. The city does not pause, but it remembers in subtle ways, in policy changes, in classroom discussions, in the quiet resilience of a mother who refused to let silence prevail. The story that began with rain and disappearance concludes not with triumph, but with sober clarity. A confession revealed a truth that had long been buried, exposing the chain of decisions that transformed ambition into violence and silence into complicity. The impact endures in the hearts of those who loved Elena and in the consciousness of a community that learned the price of ignoring warning signs. In the end, the case is more than a headline or a courtroom victory. It is a reminder etched into the fabric of Ciudad de Mexico that justice may falter, investigations may stall, and secrets may hide beneath layers of power, but memory, unyielding, insistent memory, can outlast them all. Time did not soften the edges of what happened in 1995. It merely reshaped the way the city carried it. In the years following the conviction, Ciudad de Mexico moved forward with its usual relentless rhythm, traffic surging down Insurgentes, vendors shouting over the hiss of frying oil, construction cranes carving new angles into the skyline. Yet beneath that motion lingered an awareness that one of its long-buried secrets had surfaced and altered the narrative of power forever. The cold case that once symbolized failure had become a case study in endurance, a reminder that silence is never absolute. Elena Vargas's name began appearing in places no one could have predicted decades earlier. A scholarship fund was established at her former university, awarded to students pursuing law with a focus on transparency and public accountability. Each year, during the ceremony, professors retold the story not as sensational tragedy, but as cautionary history. They spoke of a young woman who believed documents mattered, who trusted that facts could challenge influence. The auditorium would fall silent as her photograph illuminated the screen, a frozen moment of 1995 projected into the present. For many students, she was no longer just a victim. She was a symbol of unfinished work. Investigative journalists continued probing the era that had allowed Ricardo Mina's operations to flourish unchecked. Old alliances were mapped out like crime scene diagrams, connecting politicians, contractors, and regulators. Though most could not be prosecuted due to expired statutes or lack of direct evidence, the exposure itself shifted public perception. Citizens demanded clearer bidding processes, open data portals, independent oversight committees. The ripple effect extended beyond one confession, transforming it into a catalyst for structural change. What began as a mysterious disappearance evolved into a broader indictment of complacency. Inside prison, Ricardo's appeals moved slowly through the legal system. His lawyers argued procedural flaws, questioned evidentiary standards, sought sentence reductions. But each motion was met with fierce opposition from prosecutors determined to preserve the integrity of the verdict. Public interest remained high. Court updates trended on social media, analyzed by legal commentators in primetime broadcasts. The man who once avoided scrutiny now lived under constant examination. His image shifted from respected entrepreneur to cautionary figure, invoked whenever discussions turned to corruption disguised as success. For the Vargas family, the years after sentencing carried a different weight. Grief transformed into something steadier, less chaotic, but no less profound. Elena's mother spent afternoons organizing her daughter's preserved notebooks, donating some to university archives. Reading through marginal notes and highlighted passages, she discovered fragments of ambition that had never been fulfilled. In quiet interviews, she spoke not of vengeance but of vigilance, urging young people to question authority while protecting themselves. Her voice, once trembling with uncertainty, now carried a measured resolve forged through decades of endurance. Community members who had once marched with candles began mentoring youth activists, recounting how easily public outrage can fade without sustained effort. They described the exhaustion of fighting for attention in the late 1990s, when headlines shifted and investigative budgets shrank. Their stories served as living testimony to the importance of persistence. The city's collective memory, once fragmented, became more cohesive, strengthened by the clarity of resolution. At the ravine, the modest plaque weathered sun and rain, but it never stood alone. Fresh flowers appeared regularly, sometimes accompanied by letters folded carefully beneath stones. Visitors wrote about courage, about lost potential, about their own fears and hopes. The site evolved into a quiet place of reflection, not only for Elena, but for all unresolved questions that once haunted the city. It was proof that even desolate ground can become sacred through remembrance. The office complex built atop the former construction site continued operating, its glass facade reflecting clouds and traffic lights. Employees commuting through its lobby often remained unaware of the history beneath their feet, yet management installed a small exhibit in the building's atrium acknowledging the past. It detailed the transformation from abandoned project to symbol of reform, emphasizing transparency policies implemented after the trial. Some criticized the gesture as symbolic at best, but others saw it as necessary acknowledgement, an admission that development cannot erase memory. Media coverage gradually shifted tone from sensational to reflective. Documentaries explored the psychology of delayed confession, examining how guilt can simmer beneath decades of denial. Experts debated whether Ricardo's admission stemmed from conscience, fear of exposure, or the simple erosion of time. Regardless of motive, the impact was undeniable. His words had unlocked a chain of evidence that forced the city to confront a truth long suspected but never proven. In classrooms and public forums, discussions about whistleblowing gained urgency. Legal scholars referenced Elena's attempt to expose irregularities, analyzing what protections existed then and what safeguards have since been implemented. The narrative inspired proposals for stronger anonymity measures and independent reporting channels. The cold case, once a static symbol of tragedy, became dynamic, influencing policy and education. As another decade approached since the confession, the story entered a new phase. Younger journalists, who had been children when Elena disappeared, revisited the archives with fresh perspective. They interviewed retired detectives who admitted mistakes, acknowledging how assumptions and pressure had narrowed early investigations. Those candid reflections added nuance to the historical record, demonstrating that systemic flaws are rarely the product of one villain alone. They are accumulations of oversight, fear, and misplaced trust. Elena's former classmates, now professionals scattered across the country, gathered for a reunion marking 30 years since graduation. They shared memories not only of lectures and exams, but of the marches that followed her disappearance. For some, the case had shaped career paths, pushing them toward public service or investigative journalism. They spoke of survivors' guilt, of the uneasy awareness that chance separated their futures from hers. In their stories, Elena remained 24, forever on the verge of adulthood. The city itself seemed to absorb the lesson in subtle ways. Public forums became more contentious, citizens more willing to challenge opaque decisions. While corruption did not vanish, the tolerance for it diminished. The phrase mysterious disappearance no longer implied inevitable failure. It carried the possibility of eventual reckoning. That shift in mindset, though intangible, represented one of the case's most enduring legacies. In the twilight hours, when traffic noise softened and the skyline shimmered against the dark, it was possible to imagine the city breathing differently than it had in 1995. Not lighter, exactly, but more aware. The knowledge that truth had emerged after nearly 3 decades instilled a cautious optimism. It suggested that memory, when sustained by collective will, can outlast intimidation and decay. Yet the emotional core of the story remained deeply personal. For the Vargas family, anniversaries continued to arrive with quiet intensity. They visited the plaque, placed fresh flowers, and spoke Elena's name aloud. The ritual was simple but profound, a declaration that she would never again be reduced to a file number or a headline. Her life, though brief, had reshaped institutions and awakened a generation. As the years continue to pass, the narrative of Ciudad de Mexico 1995 cold case resolved endures as more than resolved litigation. It stands as an enduring testament to the persistence of truth and the cost of silence. The confession that once stunned a nation has become part of civic consciousness, a reminder that power built on deception cannot remain stable forever. Beneath the city's expanding skyline lies the memory of a confrontation in an unfinished building, a moment when ambition collided with integrity and produced irreversible loss. The story does not end with a prison sentence or a plaque in a ravine. It lives in the choices of those who remember, in the vigilance of journalists who question, in the courage of students who study the past and vow to improve the future. It lives in the understanding that justice may arrive late, scarred by delay, but its arrival still matters. And in the heart of Ciudad de Mexico, amid noise and motion, the echo of Elena Vargas endures, not as a whisper of tragedy alone, but as a steady reminder that even the coldest cases can ignite change when truth finally forces its way into the light. 3 decades after that rain-soaked night in 1995, the city still remembers where it was when the confession broke, when the words "cold case resolved" flashed across screens and reopened wounds that had never fully healed. Memory in Ciudad de Mexico does not move in straight lines. It loops back on itself, threading past and present together until they are impossible to separate. What began as a mysterious disappearance became a landmark in the city's moral history, a dividing line between an era when influence could smother truth indefinitely and a new, uneasy understanding that even buried crimes leave fingerprints on the future. In the years following the final appeals, when Ricardo Mina's sentence was upheld and the legal avenues exhausted, public attention gradually shifted from the spectacle of trial to the quieter consequences of exposure. His former companies were dismantled, assets liquidated, partnerships dissolved. Buildings that once bore his name were rebranded, logos removed from facades as if distance could erase association. Yet the architectural footprint remained, silent testimony to how deeply his influence had once penetrated the urban landscape. Each time a tenant entered those structures, whether aware of the history or not, they moved through spaces financed by ambition that had crossed a fatal line. For Elena Vargas's family, life settled into a new rhythm defined less by court dates and more by remembrance. Her mother, now moving more slowly, continued to attend the annual scholarship ceremony at the university. She would sit in the front row as a new recipient stepped onto the stage, often a young woman with the same determined gaze Elena once carried. When invited to speak, she did not recount the violence in detail. She spoke of curiosity, of integrity, of the responsibility that accompanies knowledge. The applause that followed was never loud in a celebratory sense, but steady and respectful, the sound of a community honoring resilience rather than tragedy. Journalists who had covered the case from its earliest days often reflected on how close it had come to permanent obscurity. In 1995, limited technology, political pressure, and scarce forensic resources had constrained the investigation. Files were physical, communication slower, data easier to misplace. By the time the confession surfaced in 2023, digital tools and renewed public scrutiny transformed the landscape. Analysts revisited old evidence with modern methods, reconstructing timelines once blurred by uncertainty. The contrast between eras underscored how fragile justice can be when systems lack transparency. Elena's case became a bridge between generations of investigative practice, cited in seminars about how advancements in record-keeping and accountability can resurrect truths thought lost. Community organizations leveraged that momentum to advocate for long-term archival preservation. They argued that cold cases should never be relegated to forgotten shelves, that periodic reviews must be mandatory rather than optional. Policy proposals were drafted, debated, and in some instances adopted, requiring law enforcement agencies to re-examine unsolved disappearances at set intervals. While not every case yielded breakthroughs, the institutional shift carried symbolic weight. The lesson was clear: delay does not equal defeat. In quieter corners of the city, the personal reverberations continued. Former classmates of Elena, now parents themselves, told their children about the protests that once filled the streets, about chanting her name under banners demanding answers. They described the fear that followed her disappearance, the suspicion that power had intervened to mute investigation. For younger listeners, it sounded almost distant, a chapter from a different Mexico. Yet the conviction, the excavated ravine, the documented confession anchored the story firmly in reality. It was not legend. It was history with names, dates, and consequences. Ricardo Mina's health reportedly deteriorated further as years passed behind bars. Occasional reports surfaced about his attempts to write a memoir, a document some speculated would frame his actions as tragic misjudgment rather than deliberate concealment. Whether such a manuscript will ever emerge remains uncertain. What is certain is that his identity is now inseparable from the crime he confessed to committing. The philanthropic galas, the ribbon-cutting ceremonies, the glossy magazine profiles have been eclipsed by a single defining narrative. In the court of public memory, his legacy has narrowed to a cautionary example of how swiftly power can collapse under the weight of truth. The ravine where Elena's remains were found has gradually transformed into a modest memorial site. Volunteers maintain the surrounding area, clearing debris and repainting the small metal fence that protects the plaque. On significant anniversaries, a few dozen people gather, lighting candles as dusk settles over the uneven terrain. There are no grand speeches, only brief reflections and shared silence. The simplicity of the ritual stands in contrast to the magnitude of what occurred there. It is an acknowledgement that remembrance does not require spectacle, it requires consistency. Urban development continues to reshape Ciudad de Mexico, new towers rising, old neighborhoods evolving. Yet planners and civic leaders reference the 1995 case in discussions about ethical oversight. Training sessions for municipal employees include modules on conflict of interest and whistleblower protections, often introduced with a brief summary of Elena's confrontation with corruption. The story serves as both warning and motivator, a reminder that behind every permit and signature lies potential human consequence. As the 40th anniversary of Elena's disappearance approaches, media retrospectives once again revisit the timeline, blending archival footage with contemporary interviews. Younger audiences encounter the case for the first time, reacting with disbelief that it remained unsolved for so long. Older viewers watch with a different emotion, recalling the uncertainty that defined nearly 3 decades. The contrast between ignorance and hindsight creates a layered experience, illustrating how narratives evolve once hidden facts surface. Despite the institutional reforms and symbolic gestures, the emotional center of the story remains deeply intimate. There are moments when Elena's mother, sitting by a window overlooking the same streets her daughter once walked, allows herself to imagine alternate futures. A career in law, perhaps a family of her own, a presence at holiday dinners. Those imagined lives are tender and painful, existing parallel to reality, but never intersecting. Justice clarified the past. It did not rewrite destiny. In public discourse, the phrase cold case resolved has acquired nuance. It no longer suggests simple triumph. It carries awareness of cost, of time lost, of grief compounded by delay. Commentators emphasize that resolution, while essential, cannot restore what violence removed. Yet they also acknowledge that truth, even belated, prevents erasure. It anchors memory, offers families a narrative grounded in fact rather than speculation. As night descends over Ciudad de Mexico and lights shimmer across the valley, the city hums with continuity. Buses rumble, conversations spill from open windows, construction cranes pause against the dark sky. Somewhere within that vast expanse, the memory of a young woman who asked difficult questions persists. Her story has become interwoven with the city's identity, shaping conversations about courage and consequence. It reminds residents that beneath the surface of ordinary days lie histories that demand recognition. The narrative that began with a rainstorm and a vanished student has stretched across decades, through denial, confession, trial, and reform. It has tested patience, exposed corruption, and redefined accountability. In its final measure, it stands as testament to the endurance of memory and the inevitability of truth. The city that once feared the disappearance now carries the lesson forward, vigilant against complacency, aware that justice may arrive late, but must never be abandoned. And in that awareness, in the steady commitment to remember, Elena Vargas's presence endures, not confined to tragedy, but elevated as a permanent call to conscience in the heart of Ciudad de Mexico. 40 years is a long time for a city to carry a wound, yet in Ciudad de Mexico the memory of 1995 still moves beneath the surface, like a fault line that never fully sealed. Children born long after Elena Vargas disappeared now walk the same university corridors she once crossed, their footsteps echoing against polished floors that have been renovated and repainted, unaware that decades earlier those halls were filled with frantic whispers and hastily printed posters bearing her face. Time has modernized the skyline, digitized archives, and replaced abandoned lots with glass towers, but it has not erased the emotional imprint of a cold case that reshaped the city's conscience. As the 40th anniversary of her disappearance approached, national media prepared extensive retrospectives, framing the story as both cautionary tale and hard-won triumph. Yet the tone had evolved. The early coverage after Ricardo Mina's confession was charged with shock, with the electricity of revelation. Now the narrative carried a steadier cadence, reflective rather than explosive. Analysts examined not only the crime itself, but the socio-political climate that allowed it to remain unsolved for nearly 3 decades. They dissected the fragile infrastructure of the mid-1990s, when corruption thrived in bureaucratic shadows and investigative resources were thin. The discussion extended beyond one perpetrator, exploring systemic vulnerabilities that can transform individual violence into prolonged injustice. At the university, the Elena Vargas Scholarship had grown into a respected program supporting students committed to public interest law. Recipients often cited her case in essays about why transparency matters, why documents and accountability are not abstract principles but safeguards against real harm. During the annual ceremony marking 40 years since her disappearance, the auditorium filled beyond capacity. Alumni, current students, faculty, and members of the public gathered not merely to remember, but to reaffirm shared values. When Elena's mother, now frail yet resolute, addressed the audience. Her voice carried a quiet authority forged by endurance. She spoke of persistence, of refusing to let fear dictate silence, and of the complicated relief that accompanies truth after decades of uncertainty. The applause that followed felt less like celebration and more like collective commitment. Ricardo Mina, aging behind prison walls, remained a distant figure in these commemorations. His health had reportedly declined significantly, and legal experts speculated about compassionate release petitions that might arise due to medical conditions. Each rumor reignited public debate. Some argued that mercy should be considered in light of his confession and deteriorating state. Others insisted that the magnitude of harm, compounded by years of concealment, demanded that his sentence stand unchanged. The discussion revealed the enduring tension between justice and compassion, a tension sharpened by time, but never simplified. Meanwhile, Javier Salgado and Martini Barra, serving their own sentences for complicity, largely faded from public conversation. Their roles, once scrutinized intensely during trial, became footnotes in broader analyses of systemic corruption. Yet their stories continued to resonate in quieter ways. In interviews conducted by criminologists studying long-term guilt and obedience, references to their fear-driven decisions surfaced as case studies in how authority can pressure individuals into catastrophic choices. Their admissions underscored a sobering lesson. Silence is often sustained not by malice alone but by intimidation and self-preservation. Urban policy reforms inspired in part by the case matured over the decades. Digital transparency platforms allowed citizens to track development permits and public expenditures in real time. Whistleblower protections were strengthened, creating safer channels for reporting irregularities. While corruption did not disappear entirely, its concealment became more difficult. Civic watchdog groups, some founded by former classmates of Elena, monitored municipal projects with relentless scrutiny. They cited her story as proof that vigilance must be continuous, not reactive. The ravine where her remains were discovered transformed into a recognized memorial site, modest yet dignified. On the 40th anniversary, a larger gathering assembled there at dusk. Candles flickered against the encroaching dark, their light fragile but persistent. Speakers recounted the timeline from disappearance to confession, not in sensational detail, but with solemn clarity. The emphasis rested on memory and responsibility rather than spectacle. Younger attendees listened intently, absorbing a history that shaped their present freedoms. In Colonia Narvart, where Elena once lived, neighbors organized a community forum reflecting on how the case altered their perception of safety and power. Older residents described the fear that followed her disappearance, the sense that influence could eclipse truth. Younger participants spoke about the relative openness of contemporary institutions, acknowledging improvements while recognizing ongoing challenges. The conversation bridged generations, illustrating how collective memory can foster dialogue rather than division. Media portrayals of the case shifted again with the release of a comprehensive documentary series marking the anniversary. The production wove together archival footage, courtroom transcripts, and contemporary interviews, presenting a layered narrative that traced the arc from mysterious disappearance to late confession and lasting reform. Viewers across the country engaged in renewed discussion, debating the psychology of delayed remorse and the resilience of families who refuse to abandon hope. This series avoided dramatization of violence, focusing instead on the emotional and civic repercussions that extended far beyond the initial crime. For the Vargas family, anniversaries remain deeply personal milestones. The plaque at the ravine bore fresh flowers, as it had for years, but on this occasion the gathering lingered longer. Elena's mother, supported by relatives, placed her hand on the engraved metal and closed her eyes. Observers described the moment as one of quiet communion rather than grief alone. After decades defined by searching, protesting, and testifying, remembrance had become an act of steady affirmation. Elena was no longer missing. She was acknowledged, her story integrated into the city's fabric. As dusk deepened into night, the skyline of Ciudad de Mexico shimmered with familiar brilliance. Towers erected after 1995 stood beside older structures that had witnessed the uncertainty of the investigation's early days. Among them remained the office complex that replaced the abandoned construction site where confrontation turned fatal. Its glass exterior reflected the candlelight from a distant vigil, a visual reminder that progress and memory coexist. Employees inside worked late into the evening, perhaps unaware of the layered history beneath their foundation, yet the building itself had become part of the narrative, cited in ethics seminars and urban planning courses as an example of how spaces carry stories. Public discourse surrounding the case increasingly emphasized legacy over loss. Commentators argued that while Elena's life was tragically cut short, her impact extended beyond what she might have imagined. The exposure of corruption, the strengthening of oversight mechanisms, the empowerment of civic activism, these developments traced part of their lineage to the persistence sparked by her disappearance. Such reflections did not romanticize tragedy, but acknowledged the tangible change that followed. Still, in private moments, the human dimension prevailed. Elena's family preserved letters she wrote in 1995, youthful handwriting filled with plans and aspirations. Reading them decades later evoked both pride and sorrow. The future she envisioned unfolded differently, yet her determination reverberated through the institutions that now cite her example. That paradox, loss intertwined with influence, defines the enduring complexity of her story. As the 40th year closed, the city's attention gradually shifted to new challenges, new headlines. Yet the narrative of Ciudad de Mexico 1995 cold case resolved remained embedded in public consciousness. It served as a reminder that justice can be delayed but not indefinitely denied, that confession can fracture decades of silence, and that communities possess the capacity to transform pain into reform. The memory of that rain-soaked night, of a young woman who refused to ignore irregularities, continues to inform conversations about accountability and courage. In the vast expanse of a metropolis constantly reinventing itself, some stories fade while others crystallize into enduring reference points. Elena Vargas's case has become one of those fixed markers, a point against which progress is measured and complacency challenged. The city carries her memory not as a burden alone but as a compass, guiding its institutions toward greater transparency and reminding its citizens that vigilance is the price of justice. And so, as traffic flows and neon lights pulse against the dark, the echo of 1995 endures, woven permanently into the evolving story of Ciudad de Mexico, a testament to truth that refused to remain buried. Half a century after the night the rain swallowed the sound of her footsteps, Ciudad de Mexico no longer speaks of 1995 as a distant tragedy, but as a turning point etched into its civic DNA. 50 years is enough time for skylines to reinvent themselves, for political eras to rise and collapse, for generations to inherit stories they did not witness, yet somehow carry. And still, when the anniversary arrives, the name Elena Vargas moves through conversations with a quiet gravity that refuses to fade. The cold case that once symbolized despair has become an enduring marker of how truth, delayed and battered, can still reshape a city's conscience. By the 50th anniversary, the narrative had transcended crime reporting and entered the realm of collective memory. Schools reference the case not only in law and ethics courses, but in history curricula examining late 20th century Mexico. Students analyzed how social structures, media limitations, and political alliances intersected to stall justice. They debated the fragile balance between courage and caution, discussing what it means to confront power when safeguards are insufficient. Elena's story no longer existed solely as a personal tragedy. It functioned as a lens through which to examine institutional evolution. The university where she once studied unveiled a permanent exhibit dedicated to her life and the broader implications of the case. Photographs from her childhood, excerpts from her notebooks, and archived news clippings were displayed alongside documentation of the investigation's reopening decades later. Interactive screens allowed visitors to explore the timeline, from mysterious disappearance to confession and conviction. The exhibit avoided sensationalism, focusing instead on context and consequence. It framed her determination as emblematic of a generation that demanded transparency during a period when such demands were often met with resistance. In Colonia Narvart, the building where Elena lived in 1995 had been renovated several times, its facade modernized, its interiors updated. Yet residents still referred to it as the place where the long wait began. On the 50th anniversary, neighbors organized a commemorative walk tracing the route she likely took on her final evening. Participants ranged from elderly residents who remembered the candlelight vigils to teenagers who had learned about the case through documentaries. As they moved through familiar streets, traffic paused briefly, drivers watching in respectful silence. The walk was not a reenactment, but a reclamation, a declaration that memory belongs to the community, not to the perpetrator. Ricardo Mina did not live to see the 50th anniversary. He died in prison several years earlier, his final appeals unresolved. His death sparked muted reactions. There were no public celebrations, no dramatic headlines beyond brief notices summarizing his conviction and sentence. For many, his passing closed a biological chapter, but did not alter the moral accounting. He remained defined by the confession that shattered decades of denial. Historians analyzing the case noted how his trajectory mirrored broader themes of power and downfall, of influence that seemed impenetrable until conscience or circumstance fractured its facade. The Ravine Memorial had evolved into a landscape site maintained by a small foundation established in Elena's name. Native plants lined the path leading to the plaque, and benches invited quiet reflection. On the 50th anniversary evening, candles illuminated the area once more, their glow reflecting off polished metal bearing her name and the years that framed her brief life. Speakers included former scholarship recipients who had built careers in public service, investigative journalism, and nonprofit advocacy. They described how learning about her determination influenced their choices, how the knowledge of her fate reinforced their commitment to ethical practice. Their voices carried across the ravine, blending remembrance with resolve. Over 5 decades, the city's infrastructure for transparency had strengthened significantly. Digital archives ensured that no permit or contract could vanish without trace. Independent oversight committees operated with statutory authority, and whistleblower protections were robust. Analysts frequently cited the 1995 case as an early catalyst for these reforms. While systemic challenges persisted, the mechanisms for accountability were undeniably more resilient than they had been in the era of fax machines and paper files. The transformation illustrated how tragedy, when confronted rather than buried, can stimulate institutional growth. Media coverage on the 50th anniversary adopted a contemplative tone. Long-form articles revisited interviews conducted over the years with Elena's mother, now gone as well, preserving her words about persistence and hope. Journalists reflected on how the initial investigation faltered under pressure and limited resources, and how the confession decades later forced a reevaluation of assumptions. The phrase cold case resolved appeared again, but now it carried historical weight rather than immediate shock. It signified a completed arc, a narrative that traveled from uncertainty to revelation to reform. Among younger generations, the case inspired creative expression. Playwrights staged productions exploring themes of memory and justice. Musicians composed pieces dedicated to unsolved stories that eventually found answers. Artists painted murals in neighborhoods across the city, depicting Elena not as a victim alone but as a figure confronting a towering silhouette of corruption. These cultural responses ensured that her story remained accessible beyond textbooks and court transcripts. They translated legal milestones into emotional resonance. In private spaces, families who had followed the case since the beginning gathered for intimate commemorations. Former classmates, now grandparents, shared faded photographs from university days, recalling study sessions and heated debates about constitutional law. They spoke of the fear that gripped them in 1995, the suspicion that truth might never emerge. Watching their grandchildren listen with wide eyes, they recognized the generational bridge forged by the case. What once felt like an open wound had become a scar that guided vigilance. Ciudad de Mexico itself seemed to acknowledge the anniversary with understated dignity. Civic leaders issued statements reaffirming commitment to transparency and justice, careful not to appropriate the narrative, but to honor its impact. Public buildings lowered flags briefly at sunset, a symbolic gesture recognizing the enduring significance of a life interrupted. The gesture did not dominate headlines, yet it signaled institutional acknowledgement of history's imprint. As darkness settled over the valley, the skyline shimmered as it had on countless nights before. Neon lights pulsed, traffic lights shifted from red to green, life continuing with relentless momentum. Yet within that motion lingered an awareness that 50 years earlier, a confrontation in an unfinished building set off a chain of events that would challenge the city's integrity for decades. The rain of 1995 had long since evaporated, but its memory remained suspended in collective consciousness. The narrative of Ciudad de Mexico 1995 cold case resolved now stands not merely as a record of crime and punishment, but as a testament to endurance. It illustrates how communities can transform grief into advocacy, how delayed confession can ignite reform, how remembrance can fortify institutions against complacency. Elena Vargas's life, though brief, altered the trajectory of conversations about power and accountability. Her absence became a presence that shaped policy, inspired scholarship, and united generations in shared reflection. 50 years later, the city carries her story with a steadier pulse. It no longer trembles with shock, yet it does not forget. In the quiet glow of candles at the ravine, in the determined voices of students studying ethics, in the digital transparency systems safeguarding public trust, her legacy persists. The cold case that once haunted Ciudad de Mexico has evolved into a compass, pointing toward vigilance and integrity. And as the metropolis continues to expand and redefine itself, the echo of 1995 endures, a solemn reminder that truth, however delayed, can rise from beneath the weight of silence and illuminate the path forward for generations to come. The 50th anniversary did not mark an ending so much as a quiet transformation, a shift from remembrance rooted in pain to remembrance grounded in responsibility. As Ciudad de Mexico moved beyond the commemorative ceremonies and returned to its relentless rhythm, the legacy of 1995 continued to ripple through institutions, neighborhoods, and private lives. What had once been a singular tragedy gradually evolved into a framework for vigilance, influencing how citizens interpreted power, how officials exercised authority, and how families discussed trust around their dinner tables. The passage of 5 decades had softened none of the essential lessons, yet it had given the city a broader perspective on how deeply one unresolved crime could shape civic identity. In the years following the anniversary, researchers undertook comprehensive studies examining the long arc of the investigation and its consequences. Sociologists mapped the correlation between public pressure generated by the case and subsequent legislative reforms. Legal scholars dissected procedural failures that characterized the original inquiry, contrasting them with the safeguards that later emerged. Their findings circulated in academic journals and policy forums, reinforcing a central conclusion that accountability is rarely immediate but can become inevitable when sustained by collective memory. The case became a reference point not only for criminal justice reform but also for discussions about media ethics and civic engagement. Digital technology played a crucial role in preserving that memory. Archives that once required physical access were now available to anyone with an internet connection. Scanned documents, televised interviews, and court transcripts formed a comprehensive repository that prevented distortion. Students born decades after 1995 navigated these materials with fluency, piecing together timelines and analyzing inconsistencies with a sophistication unimaginable during the early years of the investigation. The transparency offered by digital preservation reduced the risk of mythologizing events, anchoring public understanding in documented fact rather than rumor or speculation. Families of other missing persons often cited Elena's case as a source of endurance. Although each disappearance carried unique circumstances, the eventual resolution of a decades-old mystery provided a measure of hope that time alone does not extinguish truth. Support networks formed in community centers across the city, drawing inspiration from the persistence demonstrated over half a century. These gatherings emphasized solidarity rather than despair, encouraging participants to demand institutional responsiveness while sustaining emotional resilience. In this way, the legacy of one resolved case extended outward, influencing countless ongoing efforts for clarity and justice. Urban planners also acknowledged the symbolic weight of specific locations associated with the case. The unfinished building where the confrontation occurred had long since been replaced by a modern complex of offices and apartments. Yet a small public courtyard incorporated into the design served as a deliberate gesture toward remembrance. Without dramatizing the past, the space invited reflection through subtle architectural elements that suggested openness and accountability. Visitors unfamiliar with the history might perceive only a tranquil plaza, but those aware of its significance recognized it as a quiet testament to transformation. Political discourse in Ciudad de Mexico matured alongside these cultural shifts. Candidates seeking office could no longer dismiss allegations of misconduct with confidence that time would erode scrutiny. The shadow of 1995 lingered as a cautionary reminder that suppressed truths can resurface decades later with amplified consequences. Debates during municipal elections frequently reference the importance of transparent procurement processes and independent oversight, principles strengthened in the wake of the case. While corruption did not vanish entirely, its exposure became more swift and less easily contained. The personal dimension of the story endured most vividly within the Vargas family. Extended relatives, scattered across different regions, maintained annual gatherings not solely to mourn but to celebrate the values Elena embodied. Stories about her determination and curiosity were shared with children who knew her only through photographs. These intimate rituals ensured that her identity remained multifaceted, defined by more than the circumstances of her death. In preserving her complexity, the family resisted the reduction of her life to a headline or a legal precedent. Cultural production continued to reinterpret the events through evolving artistic lenses. Documentary filmmakers revisited archival footage with contemporary commentary, exploring how narrative framing influenced public perception at different historical moments. Novelists crafted fictionalized accounts that examined the psychological toll of prolonged uncertainty, situating individual grief within broader societal dynamics. These works did not seek to exploit tragedy, but to probe the mechanisms through which societies process unresolved trauma. By engaging audiences emotionally and intellectually, they sustained dialogue about responsibility and reform. International observers occasionally reference the case when analyzing transitional justice in urban contexts. Although it did not involve regime change or mass atrocity, its trajectory illustrated how persistent civic engagement can pressure institutions towards self-correction. Conferences on legal reform highlighted the interplay between investigative journalism, family advocacy, and gradual policy shifts. Ciudad de Mexico thus contributed an example to global conversations about how democracies confront internal failures without descending into cynicism or apathy. As the city advanced further into the 21st century, demographic changes introduced new perspectives. Immigrants from other regions and countries brought distinct experiences with governance and accountability. Encountering the story of 1995 through local media and educational programs, they integrated it into their understanding of their adopted home. The narrative functioned as both warning and reassurance, revealing past vulnerability while demonstrating capacity for reform. This duality reinforced a nuanced civic pride grounded not in perfection, but in demonstrated resilience. Environmental changes also altered the physical landscape that once framed the original search efforts. Infrastructure improvements mitigated flooding in neighborhoods that had been vulnerable during the rainy season of 1995. Expanded public transportation networks connected districts that once felt isolated. These tangible developments underscored how cities evolve materially over decades, even as intangible memories persist. The contrast between modern transit lines and the dimly lit streets described in early reports accentuated the passage of time. Ultimately, the 50th anniversary served as a bridge between remembrance and forward motion. It reaffirmed that justice delayed, while deeply painful, can catalyze enduring reform when communities refuse to surrender to silence. The cold case, once synonymous with frustration, had become a durable reference for integrity, woven into policy discussions, artistic expression, and everyday conversation. Ciudad de Mexico continued to expand, innovate, and confront new challenges, yet the echo of 1995 remained an orienting force. Through sustained attention and evolving understanding, the city transformed a wound into a compass, ensuring that future generations inherit not only the memory of loss but also the conviction that truth, however long obscured, retains the power to reshape the civic landscape. 50 years had passed since the rain soaked the streets and sealed a silence that seemed permanent, yet the city continued to discover new meanings within that silence. What began as a single unresolved disappearance had grown into a layered chronicle of grief, endurance, reform, and memory. By the time the story reached its 9th chapter in the collective consciousness of Ciudad de Mexico, it no longer revolved solely around the crime itself. It revolved around the ways a society reshapes itself when confronted with its own vulnerabilities and chooses, however slowly, to confront them rather than look away. In the decades after the confession and conviction, younger historians began reframing the case not as an anomaly, but as a reflection of structural weaknesses characteristic of the era. They explored the political climate of the mid-1990s, the fragility of institutional oversight, and the complex web of influence that once shielded powerful figures from scrutiny. Their research emphasized context without diluting responsibility. By situating the tragedy within a broader social framework, they demonstrated how accountability depends not only on individual morality, but on systems designed to resist corruption and complacency. Public education evolved accordingly. High school curricula incorporated modules on civic responsibility that referenced the lessons drawn from the prolonged investigation. Students analyzed primary documents and debated how transparency mechanisms could have altered the original trajectory. Rather than presenting the case as distant history, teachers encouraged learners to imagine themselves as future jurists, journalists, or public servants. The emphasis rested on agency, reinforcing the belief that institutional culture is shaped by those who inhabit it. In classrooms across the city, the memory of 1995 became a catalyst for thoughtful engagement rather than passive reflection. The media landscape also transformed in ways that echoed the earlier failures. Independent investigative platforms flourished, supported by audiences who understood the cost of silence. Journalists cited the long struggle for truth as motivation to pursue difficult stories with patience and rigor. Editorial standards tightened, fact-checking processes became more robust, and digital transparency tools allowed readers to trace sources and verify claims. Although the pressures of modern information cycles introduced new challenges, the historical memory of delayed justice served as a caution against haste and superficiality. Families directly touched by the case carried their own quiet rituals forward. Each year they gathered, not only to remember loss, but to reaffirm resilience. They planted trees in community parks, symbolizing growth beyond tragedy. The saplings planted on the 40th anniversary were now tall enough to cast generous shade, their branches intertwining above benches where neighbors sat in conversation. These living memorials offered a tangible reminder that time, though incapable of erasing grief, can nurture renewal when guided by intention and care. Civic leaders increasingly acknowledged that the case shaped contemporary governance. Policy discussions about procurement transparency, judicial independence, and whistleblower protection often referenced historical precedents without dramatization. The tragedy functioned as a shared point of reference, an implicit understanding that negligence carries consequences beyond individual careers. Officials recognized that public trust, once fractured, demands sustained effort to rebuild. The reforms implemented over 5 decades were imperfect, yet they represented cumulative progress grounded in hard-learned experience. Urban development further altered the physical spaces once associated with uncertainty. Streets that were dimly lit in the 1990s now glowed with efficient lighting, and surveillance systems were regulated to balance safety with privacy. Public transportation connected neighborhoods that had once felt peripheral, reducing isolation and fostering integration. These infrastructural changes were not direct results of the case alone, yet the broader climate of reform it inspired contributed to a mindset that prioritized equitable access and accountability in planning decisions. Cultural memory extended beyond formal commemorations. Writers and artists continued exploring themes of silence and revelation, drawing parallels between personal secrets and institutional concealment. Murals depicting open eyes and fractured chains appeared in districts far from the original events, signaling solidarity with ongoing struggles for justice. These expressions kept the narrative alive in evolving forms, ensuring that remembrance did not ossify into static reverence, but remained dynamic and relevant. Technological advancements introduced new dimensions to archival preservation. Virtual reality reconstructions allowed users to explore historical settings while contextual commentary explained investigative milestones. Digital platforms hosted interactive timelines where viewers could examine documents and media reports chronologically. Such innovations democratized access to history, reducing dependence on gatekeepers and encouraging independent analysis. The transparency afforded by these tools contrasted sharply with the information constraints of 1995, highlighting the distance traveled over half a century. Despite progress, the story retained an undercurrent of caution. Scholars warned against complacency, noting that institutional resilience requires continuous vigilance. They pointed to emerging ethical dilemmas posed by artificial intelligence, data privacy, and globalized finance, arguing that lessons from the past must inform responses to new complexities. The endurance of the 1995 memory served not as a relic, but as an active guide, reminding citizens that accountability must evolve alongside power. Personal narratives remained central to this evolving legacy. Former classmates, now elders, recounted memories of youthful ambition interrupted by fear. Their testimonies, recorded for oral history projects, conveyed emotional textures absent from official documents. Listening to their reflections, younger audiences gained insight into the psychological climate of uncertainty that once prevailed. These stories humanized the abstract language of reform, connecting policy outcomes to lived experience. The broader national context also shifted during the intervening decades. Democratic institutions matured unevenly, confronting setbacks and advances in cycles. Within that fluctuating landscape, the resolved cold case stood as evidence that persistence can eventually penetrate entrenched defenses. International observers studying urban governance cited Ciudad de Mexico as an example of gradual self-correction within a complex political environment. While no single event defined the city's evolution, the prolonged pursuit of truth contributed meaningfully to its trajectory. As the narrative entered its 9th chapter, emphasis increasingly rested on intergenerational dialogue. Parents who had once marched in candlelight vigils now accompanied their children to public forums discussing ethics and civic duty. Conversations once dominated by anger gradually incorporated reflection and resolve. The emotional tenor shifted from raw outrage to measured determination, illustrating how communities metabolize trauma over time without surrendering its instructive power. In quiet moments at the Ravine Memorial, visitors observed plaques weathered by decades of sun and rain. Names and dates remained legible, etched with deliberate permanence. The surrounding landscape, tended carefully by volunteers, symbolized ongoing stewardship of memory. People arrived alone or in small groups, some seeking contemplation, others introducing friends to a chapter of local history. The atmosphere was neither somber nor celebratory, but contemplative, acknowledging loss while affirming endurance. Ultimately, the continuation of this story demonstrated that justice is not a singular event, but a sustained commitment. The confession that once stunned the city had long since been absorbed into official records, yet its implications continued unfolding. Ciudad de Mexico carried forward a heightened awareness of how fragile truth can be when obscured by influence and fear. Through education, reform, artistic expression, and daily vigilance, the community transformed a prolonged wound into a durable source of guidance. 50 years after the rain fell, the echo of that night persisted not as a haunting, but as a steady reminder that collective memory, when honored and examined, can illuminate even the most shadowed corners of civic life. As the story entered its 10th chapter in the long arc of remembrance, Ciudad de Mexico no longer regarded the events of 1995 solely as a historical episode, but as a foundational reference point woven into its evolving identity. Time had expanded the distance between the present and the night when uncertainty first took hold, yet that distance did not diminish significance. Instead, it allowed the city to view the entire trajectory with clarity, tracing how an unresolved disappearance matured into a defining lesson about responsibility, resilience, and the slow architecture of justice. In the decades following the 50th anniversary, scholars continued to reassess the case through fresh analytical frameworks. Political scientists examined how public pressure influenced prosecutorial independence over time. Ethicists explored the moral obligations of institutions when confronted with internal misconduct. Urban sociologists study the interplay between media narratives and civic mobilization, arguing that sustained attention prevented the case from dissolving into obscurity. These academic explorations ensured that the story remained dynamic rather than frozen in a single interpretation. Each generation contributed new questions, deepening collective understanding of how fragile accountability can be when confronted by entrenched influence. The city's legal infrastructure reflected this accumulated awareness. Oversight committees, once considered experimental, became permanent fixtures, empowered to audit sensitive investigations and shield them from undue interference. Transparency portals provided real-time access to public contracts and judicial proceedings, reducing opportunities for quiet manipulation. While no system achieved perfection, the contrast with the limitations of the 1990s was undeniable. The prolonged journey from silence to confession had impressed upon policymakers the necessity of durable safeguards rather than temporary gestures. Public memory also evolved in tone. Earlier commemorations were marked by visible grief and palpable frustration, while later observances emphasized continuity and responsibility. On the 60th anniversary of the disappearance, community leaders organized forums focused not only on remembrance, but on forward-looking commitments. Panels addressed contemporary challenges such as digital misinformation and ethical governance in an era of rapid technological change. Speakers drew parallels between past investigative failures and modern risks, urging vigilance without surrendering to cynicism. The narrative had matured from a cry for answers into a framework for sustained civic engagement. For the Vargas family, the passage of time carried its own complex texture. Younger relatives who never met Elena grew up immersed in stories of her curiosity, integrity, and determination. Family archives preserved letters, academic papers, and photographs that conveyed a vibrant personality beyond the tragedy. These intimate artifacts ensured that remembrance remained personal rather than abstract. At gatherings, relatives balanced solemn reflection with celebration of milestones in their own lives, acknowledging that continuity itself represented a quiet triumph over loss. Cultural institutions across Ciudad de Mexico incorporated the case into broader explorations of memory and justice. Museums curated exhibitions examining how societies confront unresolved crimes, situating the 1995 events alongside international examples. Theater companies staged productions that examined the psychological dimensions of waiting and uncertainty. Visual artists created installations that juxtaposed archival documents with contemporary imagery, inviting viewers to contemplate the passage of decades. Through these varied expressions, the city sustained an active dialogue between past and present. Educational programs expanded their scope as well. Universities offered interdisciplinary seminars analyzing the case from legal, sociological, and media perspectives. Students conducted mock reviews of the original investigation, identifying procedural gaps and proposing alternative strategies. These exercises cultivated critical thinking while reinforcing ethical standards. By engaging directly with historical material, learners internalized the understanding that institutions are shaped by the decisions of individuals who must navigate pressure and principles simultaneously. Technological innovation continued to reshape archival access. Artificial intelligence tools assisted researchers in cross-referencing vast databases of documents, uncovering patterns that might otherwise remain hidden. Virtual exhibitions allowed global audiences to explore curated materials without traveling to the city. This accessibility broadened the case's impact beyond national borders, transforming it into a reference point in international discussions about delayed justice and civic persistence. The once local tragedy assumed a global resonance grounded in its instructive value. Despite progress, the city remained attentive to emerging vulnerabilities. Rapid urban growth introduced new complexities in governance, from infrastructure management to digital privacy concerns. Policymakers frequently invoked historical lessons when debating reforms, conscious that complacency could erode hard-won trust. The memory of 1995 functioned as a quiet sentinel, reminding leaders that influence can distort process unless transparency is vigilantly maintained. This awareness did not eliminate risk, but it cultivated a culture less tolerant of secrecy and evasion. In neighborhoods far removed from the original events, murals and public art continued to reference themes of truth and resilience. Younger artists reinterpreted familiar symbols through contemporary styles, connecting past struggles to present aspirations. Community centers hosted storytelling nights where residents share reflections on moments when integrity required courage. These grassroots initiatives demonstrated that the legacy belonged not only to officials or academics, but to ordinary citizens who absorbed its lessons into daily life. The Ravine Memorial remained a focal point of contemplation. Trees planted decades earlier towered above visitors, their roots anchored in soil once associated with uncertainty. The site's design encouraged reflection without spectacle, inviting individuals to engage privately with collective history. Couples strolled along the path, parents explained the significance to children, and solitary visitors paused in thoughtful silence. The memorial's endurance testified to the city's commitment to preserving memory without allowing it to stagnate. As the 10th chapter unfolded, the narrative no longer centered exclusively on the crime or its perpetrator. Instead, it highlighted the cumulative transformation that followed. The confession that once stunned the public became a pivotal moment within a larger continuum of reform. Its impact extended beyond courtroom verdicts into legislative chambers, classrooms, newsrooms, and living rooms. The story illustrated how a community can metabolize prolonged uncertainty into a catalyst for structural growth. Ciudad de Mexico continued to evolve, confronting new economic shifts, environmental pressures, and cultural innovations. Yet the echo of that distant night persisted as a steady undertone within civic consciousness. It reminded residents that progress is neither automatic nor irreversible. It underscored the necessity of questioning authority with respect yet firmness. It affirmed that justice, though delayed, can illuminate pathways towards stronger institutions when communities refuse to relinquish hope. In the quiet balance between remembrance and renewal, the city found a durable equilibrium. The events of 1995 were neither forgotten nor allowed to dominate every horizon. They existed as an integrated chapter within a broader narrative of resilience. Through sustained reflection, reform, and intergenerational dialogue, Ciudad de Mexico transformed a once haunting silence into a guiding principle. The 10th chapter closed not with finality, but with continuity, affirming that collective memory, carefully tended, can remain a living force shaping the character and conscience of a city for generations beyond the span of a single lifetime. By the time the story entered its 11th chapter, more than half a century had passed since the night that first unsettled the rhythm of Ciudad de Mexico. The city that now stretched across the valley bore only partial resemblance to the metropolis of 1995, yet the memory of that year remained embedded in its civic consciousness, like a watermark visible beneath layers of progress. Generations had come of age with no personal recollection of the original disappearance, yet they inherited a narrative shaped by perseverance, reform, and the enduring insistence that truth must surface even when buried beneath influence and fear. The evolution of public trust over those decades became one of the most studied aspects of the case's legacy. Researchers traced how confidence in local institutions declined sharply during the prolonged uncertainty, then gradually stabilized as reforms took hold. Surveys conducted across multiple decades revealed a pattern of cautious optimism, replacing resignation. Citizens learned to demand documentation, to question inconsistencies, and to participate in oversight mechanisms newly available to them. This cultural shift did not arise overnight, nor did it erase skepticism entirely, but it reflected a deeper engagement with governance that distinguished the present from the complacency of the past. In universities, doctoral dissertations continued to revisit the case from emerging theoretical perspectives. Scholars of digital ethics examined how modern investigative tools might have altered the trajectory had they existed in the 1990s. Legal theorists debated the moral weight of delayed confessions and the psychological calculus behind them. Historians contextualized the episode within broader national transformations, arguing that it symbolized a transitional moment between opaque power structures and incremental democratization. Each academic contribution added nuance, ensuring that the narrative remained fertile ground for reflection rather than a static historical artifact. Community initiatives also carried the legacy forward in practical ways. Nonprofit organizations dedicated to supporting families of missing persons cited the decades-long pursuit of answers as proof that sustained advocacy can influence institutional behavior. Workshops offered legal literacy training, equipping citizens with knowledge of their rights and available resources. Public forums invited dialogue between officials and residents, fostering transparency through conversation rather than confrontation alone. These grassroots efforts illustrated how collective memory can translate into tangible empowerment. The city's media environment had undergone profound transformation as well. Independent newsrooms operated with stronger protections and clearer ethical frameworks, informed by lessons drawn from earlier failures. Investigative journalists frequently referenced historical precedents when defending the necessity of rigorous inquiry. Digital platforms enabled rapid dissemination of information, but they also demanded heightened vigilance against misinformation. Editors invoked the memory of prolonged uncertainty as a reminder that accuracy must outweigh immediacy, reinforcing standards designed to preserve credibility. Architecturally, the metropolis continued to reinvent itself. Modern transit lines traced routes once served by aging buses, and public plazas incorporated open design principles emphasizing accessibility and visibility. Urban planners often spoke of transparency not only in governance but in physical space, advocating for environments that discourage secrecy and foster community interaction. While these developments stemmed from multiple influences, the broader cultural commitment to openness resonated with the lessons absorbed from decades of reflection. Within the Vargas family, remembrance matured into quiet stewardship. Younger members assumed responsibility for maintaining archives, digitizing photographs, and recording oral histories from aging relatives. They collaborated with educational institutions to ensure materials were preserved accurately and respectfully. Family gatherings balanced commemoration with celebration of personal milestones, demonstrating that continuity can coexist with remembrance. In preserving Elena's multidimensional identity, they safeguarded her from being reduced solely to a symbol. International observers occasionally revisited the case as an example of delayed accountability within an urban democracy. Comparative studies examined parallels with other cities confronting entrenched influence and gradual reform. Conferences on transitional justice reference the trajectory as evidence that civic persistence, though often exhausting, can yield structural change over extended timelines. These discussions position Ciudad de Mexico within a global dialogue about resilience, reinforcing the universality of lessons learned locally. As technology advanced further, archival immersion deepened. Interactive exhibits incorporated augmented reality, allowing visitors to explore reconstructed environments while contextual commentary guided interpretation. Educational applications presented timelines integrating social, political, and personal dimensions of the case. Such innovations democratized engagement, enabling individuals from diverse backgrounds to access history in ways that resonated with contemporary sensibilities. The past remained present not through static display, but through evolving mediums. Despite these advancements, civic leaders remained cautious about triumphalism. They acknowledged that reform is a continuous process susceptible to regression. Public addresses commemorating milestones emphasized humility alongside pride, recognizing that vigilance must be renewed with each generation. The memory of institutional hesitation in 1995 served as a sober reminder that power can resist scrutiny unless constrained by transparent systems and informed citizens. Artistic expression continued to reinterpret the narrative through shifting cultural lenses. Poets wrote about silence transforming into testimony. Painters depicted fractured cityscapes gradually illuminated by collective resolve. Musicians composed pieces inspired by themes of endurance and awakening. These creative works ensured that emotional dimensions of the story remained accessible, preventing it from being confined to policy analysis alone. Art bridged intellect and empathy, sustaining a holistic remembrance. Educational curricula evolved to incorporate experiential learning tied to civic responsibility. Students participated in mock investigative exercises, analyzing hypothetical scenarios shaped by ethical dilemmas reminiscent of the past. Teachers emphasized critical thinking and moral courage, encouraging learners to imagine themselves as guardians of institutional integrity. Through these pedagogical approaches, the legacy of 1995 influenced not only knowledge but character formation. The Ravine Memorial, now enveloped by mature trees and landscaped pathways, continued to attract visitors seeking reflection. Its understated design resisted spectacle, inviting contemplation rather than dramatization. Volunteers maintained the grounds with quiet dedication, viewing stewardship as a form of ongoing commitment. The site's endurance symbolized the city's determination to remember without becoming captive to sorrow. As the 11th chapter unfolded, the narrative no longer revolved around revelation, but around continuity. The confession that once altered the course of public discourse had been integrated into collective understanding. Its shock had softened into perspective, its implications absorbed into institutional norms. What remained was a steady awareness that justice requires persistence and that silence, however prolonged, need not prevail indefinitely. Ciudad de Mexico moved forward into new challenges shaped by globalization, climate change, and technological disruption. Yet beneath these evolving concerns lay a durable foundation forged through decades of reflection. The events of 1995, once a source of paralyzing uncertainty, had become a compass guiding civic behavior. Through education, reform, artistic engagement, and intergenerational dialogue, the city transformed a wound into wisdom. The 11th chapter did not signal conclusion but reaffirmed continuity, illustrating that collective memory, when nurtured with honesty and humility, can sustain a metropolis not only through its darkest hours, but through the uncharted futures that inevitably follow. The 12th chapter of this long story unfolds in a city that has lived with the echo of 1995 for so long that the memory feels almost geological, layered beneath generations of change. The streets of Ciudad de Mexico hum with the energy of a modern metropolis, towers reflecting sunlight where old buildings once stood, trains sliding beneath neighborhoods that used to rely on slow buses, and millions of people moving through routines shaped by a world very different from the one that existed on the night the mystery first emerged. Yet beneath this movement, beneath the sounds of commerce and conversation, there remains a quiet understanding shared across the city, a recognition that one cold case once forced the community to confront silence, power, and the fragile architecture of truth. By the time the narrative reaches this final chapter, the individuals who once dominated headlines have long faded from daily conversation. Their names remain in archives, court documents, and historical essays, but what persists in living memory is something larger than any single person. What persists is the long shadow cast by unanswered questions and the transformation that occurred when those questions were finally confronted. The delayed confession that once stunned the nation has settled into history as a turning point, a moment when a community realized that the passage of time does not erase responsibility and that truth, however buried, retains the power to surface. Younger generations encounter the story not through breaking news broadcasts but through classrooms, museums, documentaries, and conversations with elders who remember the uncertainty firsthand. For them, the case is both distant and immediate, distant because it unfolded decades before their birth, immediate because its consequences still shape the systems that govern their lives. They learn how a disappearance became a cold case, how a city demanded answers, how years of silence hardened into determination, and how one confession reopened wounds while illuminating the path forward. Through these retellings, the narrative becomes less about tragedy and more about endurance. In public discourse, the events of 1995 are often invoked during moments when transparency is tested. Journalists recall the era when investigations stalled under pressure and remind audiences how easily truth can be obscured when institutions grow complacent. Legal scholars reference the case while discussing reforms designed to protect investigative independence. Civic activists mention it during community meetings, not to stir fear, but to emphasize vigilance. The story functions like a compass, quietly orienting discussions about ethics, governance, and accountability. The physical landscape of the city has also absorbed the legacy. The ravine where uncertainty once gathered has long since been transformed into a carefully maintained memorial park. Trees planted during early commemorations now stretch high into the sky, their branches forming a canopy that softens the noise of the surrounding city. Visitors walk along quiet paths where plaques recount fragments of history, not with dramatic language, but with measured clarity. People pause there not only to remember the victim whose life was cut short, but also to reflect on the long struggle that followed. For the family that endured decades of waiting, the final chapters of this story are defined by continuity rather than closure. They carry memories that cannot be archived or legislated away, memories that belong only to them. Photographs preserved across generations show moments before the tragedy, ordinary smiles captured in a world that did not yet know what was coming. These images remain private treasures, reminders that behind every headline once stood a real life filled with ambitions, friendships, and quiet dreams. The broader community has learned to hold the memory with a balance of solemnity and resolve. Annual commemorations are no longer dominated by outrage or disbelief, but by reflection. Speakers talk about the importance of institutional transparency, about the courage required to challenge silence, and about the responsibility carried by each generation to guard the principles that emerged from that painful history. Young volunteers help organize these gatherings, ensuring that remembrance does not fade into routine. Cultural voices continue to reinterpret the story through art and storytelling. Writers imagine the emotional landscape of a city living with unanswered questions. Filmmakers revisit archival footage, weaving narratives that connect past investigations with present awareness. Musicians compose quiet tributes that echo themes of patience and perseverance. Through these creative expressions, the case remains alive not as a spectacle, but as a meditation on how communities confront injustice. As decades stretch further from the original events, historians note an important shift in how the narrative is understood. Early coverage emphasized shock and scandal, focusing on the sudden revelation that a trusted figure had carried a secret for years. Later analyses examined the institutional weaknesses that allowed silence to persist. Now, in this final stage of reflection, the emphasis rests on collective learning. The story has evolved from a dramatic crime narrative into a study of civic transformation. Ciudad de Mexico continues to face new challenges shaped by technology, climate pressures, and rapid urban growth. Yet the lessons drawn from the old cold case remain embedded in the culture of governance and journalism. Investigations proceed with greater scrutiny, oversight mechanisms are stronger, and public engagement has become an expectation rather than an exception. None of these changes erase the pain of the past, but they represent the determination to ensure that such silence cannot take root again. Standing in the memorial park today, one might hear the distant hum of traffic, the laughter of children playing nearby, the rustling of leaves overhead. Life moves forward with the steady rhythm of a city that refuses to be defined by a single tragedy. And yet, within that movement, there remains a subtle awareness that history has left its imprint. The night that began with confusion and fear eventually forced a reckoning that reshaped institutions, sharpened public awareness, and reminded millions that justice, even when delayed by decades, still carries meaning. This final chapter does not close the story in the way a courtroom verdict once did. Instead, it leaves the narrative suspended in the ongoing life of the city. The memory of the 1995 cold case exists now as a quiet inheritance passed from one generation to the next. It teaches that silence can be challenged, that patience can coexist with determination, and that communities, when united by the search for truth, possess the power to transform tragedy into enduring vigilance. Ciudad de Mexico moves forward beneath the vast sky of the valley, its lights shining through the night, its people building futures that earlier generations could barely imagine. Somewhere within that immense urban heartbeat, the echo of the old mystery remains, not as a haunting but as a reminder. A reminder that justice is never automatic, that truth demands courage, and that even the longest silence can eventually give way to a voice that refuses to be ignored.